much for those of you who have already joined us. We have a very, very healthy crowd today, and we are very blessed to have Mr. Nick Xenos with us, who joined in very short order and has a lot to talk about. So we'll dig right in. For those that I have not been able to meet, I see lots of familiar names and organizations in our registration list today. So great to have you back. And for those I haven't had the pleasure to meet, my name is Joanne St. Goddard. I'm the Executive Director of the Circular Innovation Council, formerly the Recycling Council of Ontario. So this is the first to kick off of our webinar series focusing on circular procurement, and it is conjunction with the World Circular Economy Forum that was held virtually in September, and this is officially one of the side events of that circular forum. So today we are blessed with an international delegation in our registration list. But the focus of today is really about how to focus on putting circular economic concepts into action. So we're going to talk specifically about buying the change you want. So in my presentation to kick off, we're going to go through a little bit about the Circular Innovation Council, our work. We're going to talk about how we see the benefits of the circular economy, expanding some of the resource recovery work that we've done historically as an organization under the RCO banner. And we're going to talk a lot about how we see the public and private agenda around procurement and supply chain to really advance and expedite or accelerate, I guess, the change to a linear to a circular economy. So with further ado, and I'll get through my slides first and ask Nick to be patient. I want to introduce him and provide his bio right at the beginning of his presentation. So I'll grind through mine first, but we want to obviously protect the majority of the time for Nick's presentation as well. So with that, next slide. So our focus as an organization, historically, as the Recycling Council of Ontario, is really about managing and improving end-of-life management, obviously through, as the title suggests, recycling. So really trying to divert as much material and create marketplaces that value end-of-life material into production cycles. What excites us, I guess, about the transition and these broader discussions under a circular economy lens is that it really expands our ability to look upstream to actually look at systems and design changes that that really value products and materials as they are produced, as they are designed, and as they're coming on to the market. And so we're shifting as an organization, really taking advantage of this new excitement around advancements to a circular economy to go beyond end-of-life management. And so as the new Circular Innovation Council, we will be driving greater recognition of the circular economy and all of its benefits, and how it can be integrated into a more of a systems change. So really, as an organization, kind of going beyond just discussing circular economy as a concept, but really trying to find market interventions, if you will, to bring those circular economic concepts into action. Next slide. So to try to put this into perspective, and I always have to remind myself what the difference is between a linear and a circular economy. And even though we're hearing the term circular economy a lot, it's perhaps maybe not well known in terms of what the difference really truly is. And this schematic really helps nail it for me in terms of what is meant between a circular and a linear. And in particular, as it relates to procurement itself. So a linear economy is based, as we've heard it a lot, take, make, and waste. And then we try to find in that economic design or that economic model places where we can actually interject sustainable practices. Whereas a circular economy is really built restoratively or regeneratively by design. So we don't bring products, we don't design products or systems unless they actually have a restorative or regenerative nature to them. And always looking at components, materials, and products to keep them at their highest utility and value at all times. And so it really allows us to to elevate our thinking or our focus sort of higher up on the supply chain. And so for me, that's really the difference between how we're bending the curve, if you will, between linear and circular economies. Next slide. So we know that the circular economy delivers multiple benefits, but they are really embedded. Its system, its design is really embedded in 4 fundamental UNEP sustainability or sustainable development goals, which I know Nick will touch on, goals 11, 12, 13, and 17. As it relates to sustainable cities and communities. And we're going to talk in relation to procurement today, as cities and municipalities and governments of all sizes and locations have procurement buying to bring to bear to market changes. Certainly that ties into responsible consumption and production, greenhouse gas emissions, energy reduction, reductions in water use, and of course, waste reduction, all related to climate action. And then of course, embedded in circular economic modeling is in fact innovative partnerships between private and public to drive the kinds of change that we're looking for. Next slide. So why would we focus on procurement? Several benefits that come to mind straight away. One of the most exciting things about a circular economy design is that it can drive economic and social as well as environmental benefits simultaneously. And I think there has been a myth, or maybe even an acceptance previously, that you have to have one over the other, that if you're trying to prioritize an environmental benefit, it actually is at a higher cost, or that you can't weave in a social benefit at the same time. But what we're learning as we become students and practitioners of a circular economy, in particular procurement, that in fact it affords us this opportunity to drive these public policy objectives simultaneously, quite superior to just this idea of trying to interject against sustainable practices into a linear economy. It certainly is direct and in real time. So as procurement specialists and the vending and supply community react, they are transitioning business models, products, and in fact, on the other side, on the buying side, requirements, and that can happen really very directly in terms of shifting market behaviors. It can be right-sized or scaled up. So we're seeing the public sector, in particular governments of all sizes, cities, provincial and federal, actually start to interject or to create requirements that are by design advancing circularity at scale. They're all buyers of goods and services. And it can really be, the requirements can really be utilized regardless of really location or size of government. We know that legislation is cumbersome, it takes time, and there's a lot that comes with designing legislation. We feel that procurement, and maybe this is the #1 benefit from my perspective, is that it can accelerate and shifts markets quite quickly, and in fact can do so without any work on requirements on regulatory or legislative changes. And so for us, we do see it quite powerful as a tool. It certainly can incent innovation, changes in terms of how we work with vendors and suppliers. And we've already seen in the work that we're doing to advance circular procurement that vendors and suppliers are quite willing and waiting just to be told what buyers want, and are transitioning their products and their business models to respond to those requirements. And it can be, and this sort of links up to the right size and the scale up comment, that it actually can drive domestic solutions. We certainly know that we need those from a waste management perspective, so we're not shipping recyclables across the world in order to integrate them back into production cycles, that we need domestic solutions. And we already talked in the context of being living in a COVID world, that we need to really look locally to being more self-sufficient. And so a direct connection to the opportunities that circular procurement can deliver on. And certainly creating the right kind of demand and supply simultaneous. And so it's this synergistic relationship that we have with buyers and suppliers, companies who are making commitments in their own right, who want to offer superior products, superior systems, and just want to be able to deliver those to market. And so they, as suppliers need buyers, buyers will need suppliers as well. So it certainly is a holistic market transition tool, and we're going to talk lots about that in the slides to come. It can be done both in the private and public sectors. Private sectors, governments certainly have broad public policy objective goals, and they can use procurement powers to drive those. We are seeing private sector companies make their own commitments and influence their own supply chains. And again, a procurement exercise. It can go beyond material management, far beyond recycling, avoidance, reuse, reduction, and that's really into that elongating or advancing value for goods and services, and certainly can be looked at very narrowly within products, packaging, or in a systems-wide approach as well. So no shortage of benefits. And the next slide, just sort of put them in the context of the triple bottom line that we all like to talk about. The environmental benefits in terms of reduced reliance on virgin material, certainly better efficiencies of existing resources, creating the right demands for recycled material and post-consumer content, which we're hearing a lot of right now in the context of reducing plastics waste and creating circular plastic economies here in Canada. Of course, the byproducts of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reduced water usage as well as waste as well. And then really targeting on single use, and certainly in the context or lens of plastics that will come up often as we move forward with government objectives. Certainly there's economic benefits, local employment opportunities as we drive local circular economies on a local basis. Innovation that I already spoke about, creating new revenue streams, improving fiscal responsibility and economic growth. And we talk about that in the context of COVID as building our resiliency. And that certainly, there's a procurement opportunity there as well. Avoidance of purchase or maintenance, or driving more durable goods, more goods that actually can be repaired and replaced. And again, elongating use, which is one of the pivotal circular economic business models. And then of course, the obvious savings in terms of not having assets depreciate over time and eventually have a cost to us in terms of disposing them. And then social benefits as well, again, driving a local economy, perhaps maybe even focusing on barriers to employment and linking that through public and private opportunities within requirements. We talk a lot these days about gender equity and supporting marginalized communities, and then fostering unique partnerships in that regard as well. So I think that's what excites us mostly about the economic, the diversity of benefits, if you will, in the triple bottom line areas that the circular economy can deliver on, and then trying to really leverage that in a procurement agenda is exciting to us and where we're at. Next slide. So just in terms of looking at a public sector and private sector opportunity, we know that governments obviously are very transparent and very deliberate about their broader public policy objectives. In the triple bottom line areas, they are very transparent and specific in terms of their buying requirements. They actually have a duty of care to their tax base in terms of how they're buying, and they are meant to sort of lead by example. And that's why we are featuring the federal government as a kickoff subject matter today to talk about not only leading by example in terms of their own right, but how they can actually work with other public sector and other levels of government to combine buying power to share resources and share ideas, and again, all in the spirit of expediting the market, and then certainly influence and educate the public. And again, that goes back to can't have circular businesses without having circular buyers. And so, that shift has to happen simultaneously. And as I mentioned, already seeing it in many public sector companies. We are actually going to follow up this webinar with how do we sell into a circular economy, and we've got some big companies who are transitioning not only product design but system designs, leveraging circular economic business models to respond to new buying requirements. We're seeing them drive those changes through supply chain requirements, following through to the chain of custody, but also the chain of production in terms of integrating their own corporate commitments, and then again influencing and educating consumers. So you can see some parallels between the private sector procurement and private sector supply chain management as it relates to these broader objectives. Next slide. So why do we start with government? Why focus on public procurement? I spoke about some of the reasons, but in terms of sort of size of the opportunity, governments represent about 15% of our average GDP. So enormous procurement and buying power opportunities. That translates to about $200 billion. So governments collectively across the country have a value of about $200 billion that they can now influence the marketplace. 160 billion of that, or 80%, is actually at a local level. So part of a key strategy for us is really working with cities who collectively have this buying power and really can work quite quickly comparatively to potentially other governments in terms of leveraging that buying power. Just an example of the government of Ontario, a $6 billion spend annually, 20% of that representing the annual provincial economic outlook. And then down to a City of Toronto level, just to take an example of municipal buying power as well. So $2 billion on an annual basis for the City of Toronto on goods and services. So, collectively a substantial amount of buying power. And again, in the absence or in parallel with regulation, can really make huge marketplace trends and advances to deliver some of these broader benefits. Next slide. So I thought I might just have a touch point to show some of the leading cities in particular, setting aside the enormous amount of advancements that the federal government's making that Nick will dig into. We are seeing a tremendous amount of interest and, in fact, activity where it relates to cities as well and regional governments. And so some of them listed there that the RCO and the Circular Innovation Council is actually working with. Next slide. So these are commitments that have been made publicly. The Government of Canada committed to reducing single-use plastics in operations and using procurement to reduce waste and support secondary plastic markets as part of the Ocean Plastics Charter. So that's an example. Nick's got a laundry list of other commitments that government's making that he's trying to weave into bringing that into real requirements. But as it relates to waste in particular and plastics, we've seen the recent announcements coming out of the federal government. The City of Toronto committed to be the first municipality in Ontario with a circular economic model and using circular procurement as the key tool to do so. The City of Montreal, who's already integrated sustainable development into sourcing practices and is working to specifically integrate circular economic activities. And then a City of Vancouver using a procurement standard to achieve zero waste. And we're working with the City of Toronto right now on the first circular building. It's a 4-year project, $30 million budget to transition this building to make it as circular as it possibly can in all aspects, from grass or ground up to final product. A very exciting project that we'll be case studying along the way. So happy to give you much of those details, but all in all, to describe to you that this is not new for some cities. There are commitments being made already. And the exciting part is that as these governments, different levels of governments, progress in their commitments and starting to action them, they can actually share resources and tools along the way for standardized implementation. Next slide. So thought it might be interesting because I know Nick's going to speak about working with the different layers or departments within government, and that being one of the toughest parts of his jobs, or maybe the most challenging but exciting. the different spend categories, which are fairly similar as we look at, how do provincial, municipal, and federal governments, where do they spend? These are pretty similar across the board. Obviously, construction and infrastructure tends to sort of take it away, especially at a municipal level, but then you're seeing IT, transportation and fleet, facilities management, furniture and office supplies, textiles and food and catering. So you can see the hierarchy, and understanding your buying spend is actually, we're learning, is the first step to really prioritizing where you should start to interject these requirements to drive these broader public policy objectives. And these change a little bit between federal, provincial and municipal, but generally those are the big benchmarks. Next slide. So thought I'd just add a slide, and I've touched on it a little bit, that we've heard a lot about green stimulus and low carbon stimulus, and as it relates to recovering, economic recoveries under a COVID-19, and we've heard that from jurisdictions right across the globe, Canada no different, and so real a gem of an opportunity here to really, as government is bringing out stimulus packages, that they look to drive the right economies and the right markets that we want, and circular, and really making good, I guess, on these circular economic commitments that they are recognizing, are really superior to linear. And so, we're starting to see, hopefully, conditions and requirements attached to that stimulus to jumpstart the right economies as we move forward. Next slide. So a couple of slides in terms of how we think you can start to buy circular. And as a practitioner in the area, we are really working with the Europeans who have piloted, who have pioneered, if you will, circular economy as an alternative to a linear economy, and in that context are already sort of digging into transitioning procurement in particular as a tool to do that. This is a common butterfly document, or a diagram as they call it, to show kind of the hierarchy. On the right-hand side, the technical nutrients, the biological nutrients, and sort of how each of the resources are weaved back into production cycles. Notable here is the smaller the circle really starts with nothing to do with, in particular, waste management or recycling, which is where our minds go with a circular economy, but really about sharing resources, and then that durability, the reuse, redistribution, and refurbishing. And at the very end, when you've gone through all of that hierarchy or those priority areas, then you want to make sure that everything that you're creating is recyclable as well. So this document is kind of the mantra. It is the backbone and the design to how we implement, and it is the common diagram used to kind of describe how circularity gets put into action. Next slide. These are the 5 business models that we have come to really use when we are working with governments who want to move forward with integrating requirements for all of their vendors and suppliers to move to circularity. The 5 big buckets, if you will: circular supplies, which is typically where the mind goes to as it relates to procurement, supplying renewable, recyclable, and biodegradable resources. So it's that product design that, of course, can be reintegrated back into circular productions. Resource recovery, which is akin to recycling, eliminating any material leakages or maximizing economic value by looping materials back into product return flows. But then the next 3 are quite different in terms of, again, expanding beyond recycling, product life extension. So can you be requiring your vendors and suppliers to really deliver on goods and services that extend current lifestyles through repairability, upgradability, and reselling? So a lot of exciting new work coming out around, what are the kinds of things you can ask vendors and suppliers to deliver on those areas. The digital age has provided us with an opportunity for more sharing platforms. And again, that's about valuing and getting the maximum value out of products. So you're seeing sharing platforms for scooters and cars and even offices through online sharing platforms. And that's being translated to now things like delivery systems for catering, et cetera. So really the digital age really helps us, I guess, jumpstart this idea of stimulating collaboration amongst product users, go to an online tool to be able to share an asset. So exciting opportunities around sharing platform. And then certainly product as a service, which is really quite innovative, and gets to this idea of not owning the asset. Once you own it, then it becomes depreciating and eventually becomes waste, for which you have to now manage. So this idea of keeping the asset or the product with the vendor itself, having them own that asset, but just getting the value out of that, out of the idea. So I don't want light bulbs, I want lumens. And there's some interesting business models that are coming through the marketplace now around this pay-for-use arrangement that we'll be highlighting in future webinars. So look for those. And just some of the resources, we're just about getting into our future presentation, but just for your own use, this month we'll be launching circularprocurement.ca. There's going to be a plethora of resources out there for those who are interested in the subject matter. This is a listing of what you can expect to see. Everything from understanding the concepts to linking circular procurement and how it delivers on circular economy, and then platforms for sharing templates around sample requests for proposals, RFPs, RFIs, evaluation matrices, case studies, business models to showcase within those 5 business models, who are some of these innovative companies and designs that are coming forward, and linking buyers with sellers in that regard as well. And then an entire platform for sharing information and best practices. So we'll be pushing out that website URL to you. And if you're interested to learn more, we can certainly to get you more involved. Just wanted to sort of share in the next slide, thanks, some of the innovative organizations, mentors, and partners that we have been forging as we move forward. There's a lot of incredible energy and expertise in this area, a lot to bridge from places like Europe. And these are some of the organizations who have, who we've been working with collaboratively nationally, but also internationally as well. So you'll see them featured on our website and all of the good works that they're doing. Next slide. In terms of those that may be interested in some of the sort of hands-on work, we have created a framework for the City of Toronto that is actually public. We're happy to share that with you for those who are in the private or public sector that want to develop your own framework for implementing circular procurement. This is a great teeth-cutting document, if you will, to understand how one of the first, of course, our largest municipality in the country has done this, and can become a framework or a template for your own if you're interested in that regard. And we're also undertaking a series of, we were doing a lot of workshops with municipalities prior to the pandemic for both buyers and all of their departments. So for municipalities in particular, the legal department, the procurement department, as well as sustainability, with all of the department heads to do some 101 work on circular economy, circular procurement, but then really get into the how-to aspects of prioritizing product categories and identifying circular economic requirements. We are moving to an online format, as we all are on many things. And so if you're interested in taking on a workshop with your organization, we'd be happy to chat to you about that. And so that brings me to the last piece, which is just featuring the upcoming webinars that are part of this series: selling change, identifying opportunity and ambition, and then measuring success as well. So we'll make sure that you're informed in terms of opportunity to register for those as well. And I think that brings me to the end of my PowerPoint presentation, so we can dig in to Nick's presentations as well. So by way of introduction, we've got a first slide that we can put up for Nick as well. Okay, thanks Nick for being so patient. as you always are. And I have been working with Nick as it relates to sustainable and circular procurement for some time. He's clearly a champion, has a lot on his plate. So we are blessed with him agreeing to be with us today and to dig into to the work that he's doing. But by way of bio, he is the executive director of the Center of Greening Government with the Treasury Board Secretariat of the Government of Canada. His center, which he's going to talk in detail about, works with departments and agencies towards low carbon, sustainable, and climate resilient government operations with the goal to lower government emissions by 40% by 2030. And I think Nick's got targets up the wazoo in every aspect that he's going to speak about. Previous to this, Nick worked with Natural Resources Canada on climate change impacts and adaptation, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada on Arctic science policy in the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, the Canadian Space Agency, and Infrastructure Canada. So has an impressive resume to bring to this particular position. And I think with that, we'll ask you to launch right into your PowerPoint, and then following that, we'll do a little bit of a Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me well. So, merci beaucoup pour l'introduction et je suis très content d'être avec vous aujourd'hui et je peux certainement prendre des questions en anglais ou français durant la présentation et je peux avoir la présentation en français aussi pour les francophones à travers le pays qui sont ici. Thank you very much. Happy to be here, and thank you for that intro, and thank you for the overall circular economy. Essentially, I can summarize my presentation with I'm trying to do what Joanne is telling us we should all do. So we're trying to do it and implement it for the Government of Canada. And we're lucky we're at the Center for Greening Government. We're at the Treasury Board Secretariat, which is kind of a central place in the Government of Canada, and we're driving the change that we'd like to see. So let's go to the next slide. We'll dig right in. One of the things Joanne had mentioned is, talk a little bit about challenges, barriers, what's enablers, et cetera. A really good thing if you want to do green procurement and aim for a circular economy is when you have a good, broad framework in your organization that supports that. And so the federal government, of course, has lots of climate change commitments. We signed up to the Paris Agreement to keep us well below 2 degrees. We have something called the Pan-Canadian Framework, and working on a climate change plan, on a sort of part 2 climate change plan overall for the country to meet our climate change objectives. But we also have the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, which is that middle picture, which does cover all of the goals, the SDG goals as well. And part of that Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, Chapter 2, is that we're going to green our own operations. And so the Government of Canada obviously has goals on climate change, on waste diversion, plastics, biodiversity, et cetera, throughout the SDG goals. And of course, if we don't do it ourselves, then how can we ask Canadians to make those changes and be greener if we can't do it ourselves? And the federal government happens to have 30,000 buildings, 20,000 engineering assets, almost 30,000 fleet vehicles, and we buy $20 billion a year. So we're in a good position to be the change and implement the stuff that we want to do as a country. And I'll just highlight the speech from the throne also reiterated the commitment to be net zero carbon by 2050. So following all that policy context, we developed something called the Greening Government Strategy, which is at the bottom right, which I'll talk about a little bit more today. So let's go to the next slide. So there you go. The overview of the Greening Government Strategy is essentially we have targets. I'll focus on a little bit more on the climate change, reducing emissions targets, but we have targets in various areas. But essentially the target is to be net zero by 2050. And we're updating the strategy now, so you'll see an updated version on the web, but it's basically net zero by 2050 and a 40% reduction of real property and fleet emissions by 2025, and overall being green and climate resilient. And so that's where we have also waste targets, plastic waste, water, and looking at biodiversity as well. And of course, the areas to focus on: real property, fleet, procurement and adaptation. And we did call it mobility in fleet because part of it is we want to move to that. We're conscious of that, products as services kind of idea. It used to be you need a certain amount of cars or whatever, but really now you just need mobility. So, and because we're a Treasury Board, the Department of Treasury Board is a department in the federal government that owns the real property policy and the fleet policy and the procurement policy. And so we're at a good department in a sort of the central management department of the government of Canada, because we can attach the green component to the other policies, real property, fleet, and procurement policies. And of course, we want to adapt to a changing climate. So something not to forget in procurement is how do we ensure we buy climate resilient things? COVID's been an interesting lesson on being resilient. And so resilience to COVID, also resilience to pandemics, so resilience to climate change impacts, et cetera, but just generally resilient. So, and so, the type of questions we get from departments is things like, is it hard and does it cost? And so we try and provide direction, guidance. We have a small fund called the Greening Government Fund, and we tap into expertise both within the federal government, places like Natural Resources Canada, or Energy Department, or Environment Canada, or our Real Property Department, Public Works, but also tap into expertise across the country and internationally, like Joanne and others. And then departments implement. And then to date, we have a 32% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions on buildings and fleet. And so the measurement is really important too. And we can actually measure performance by department, and it's on our web. You can go to the open data. We try and report by facility, if you will, on energy emissions. And there's a plethora of data there too. So, and we try and put it all on the web and try and be pretty transparent on our emissions. I'll go to the next slide. So the first thing we wanted to do, first thing is we have a policy context and government commitments in the Green Government Strategy, which I'll get into more detail. But then the second thing we want to do is, okay, what's the data? And so in terms of any kind of factor you want to look at, whether it's climate change greenhouse gas emissions, waste, or other circular economy type factors, is you want to get a picture of which areas do you need to focus on if you want to buy green. So we looked at it, and we looked at our emissions. And if you, on the left side is what you call scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it's heating and electricity of buildings and fuel in fleet. And so the vehicle fleet is at the top, and the special fleet that the federal government has that most others don't is national safety and security, aircraft, and marine. So that's our emissions. We know where our emissions are from there. It's also all on our website. And then we looked at, okay, now let's look at the procurement emissions from scope 3, indirect emissions, procurement, air travel, commuting, et cetera. So COVID, of course, has lowered dramatically our air travel and commuting. But our procurement emissions, of course, what we did is a heat map type study to say which categories of our buy have the biggest emissions and where should we focus. The government of Canada has 400,000 contracts a year, but 5% of them are worth most of the 20 billion buy we have. So let's focus on the big contracts, and let's focus on what. And so what we found pretty quickly was emissions come from things like construction. You see at the right, on the bottom right, construction, energy. So it's when we buy fuel, the emissions in the production of the fuel are here. And then the emissions from burning the fuel are on the left side. So if we buy an electric car, it's like a 2-for-1 in some ways. We actually don't burn the emissions in scope 1, but we also don't emit in production of that fuel. So it's interesting. So and then fleet and then equipment was the other big kind of area. And then we split up a little bit the other goods and services in various areas too. And so we have a kind of a sense of like relocation. One of the services, RCMP officers, defense, global affairs folks move quite a bit, right? And so relocation is a big one, for example, in services. Okay, next slide. So now that we have a heat map, we know where our emissions are. We can report very granularly on our emissions. We then said, okay, so now we got to make certain commitments and target certain areas. So we've seen that in for greenhouse gas emissions, buildings are a big one. So we require every new building to be net zero carbon. 100%. We're going to buy 100% clean electricity. We're going to divert 75% of our operational waste, including plastic waste, by 2030. 75% of the vehicles we're going to buy are going to be zero emission or hybrids, with a 80% zero emission target by 2030. And we're going to understand our risks and adapt to them, adapt to our operations to a changing climate. So we knew the big areas on buildings for emissions, it's buildings and fleet, for example. And the other one we're targeting now is embodied carbon as well, is to put up a target there to lower our embodied carbon. So the carbon in the construction materials, for example, cement, steel, etc. And this is circular economy becomes really important. We can go to the next slide. Circular economy becomes really important because the solution to getting lower carbon materials often is a circular economy solution, right? So steel, for example, has very high carbon emissions, but is good forever. So if you can ensure you continuously reuse that steel, you don't have to produce it again. So and cement similarly is what are solutions there. So the circular economy and low carbon go really well together. And our updated strategy will say we'll focus on low carbon and circular economy. So we're very excited to put the word circular economy in our green and governance strategy. And then what we do is really going to go category by category to address whatever environmental factors we care about, right? So carbon reduction is a key one, climate resilience, eliminating single-use plastics, using more sustainable plastics, reducing waste, etc. So like we've seen on the waste side, we've partnered with departments doing waste audits, and we can see now, I was surprised, a big chunk of what's in the waste stream is stuff that should be recycled or composted that isn't. So once we try and figure that out, then what's remaining in the waste stream is really a procurement issue. And we really then need to go back to the procurement of those areas and figure it out. And so we got a bunch of commitments here. And of course, what we need to do is move to implement them. So let's keep going. I'm going to leave time for questions as well. Next slide. I think most of us know this. We're of course looking at the whole life cycle, and I think that's really important to consider when you're looking at greening procurement. Next slide. So what we're doing is looking at every category of procurement spend, if you will, coming up with specific targets in each area related to the environmental factor we care about. And so I think that's a key thing on procurement, is to really go into much more detail about, do a heat map on what categories you want to focus on, because it's always going to be the 80-20 rule, and then focus on which develop criteria for those areas and really focus on those. And so we're really going to, our sort of trench warfare is going to be the top with the big contract values in the big categories of spend, where we want to establish very clear mandatory requirements. And we do that already for electricity, fleet, and real property. And we're going to do it for we want to do it for construction materials next, and then working on it in various different areas, IT, big service contracts, etc. And then for the low value procurements, we can go to the next slide. You can set a bunch of environmental requirements already, right, in a lot of those different areas. And we've done a lot of that. 40% of our 7,000 standing offers and supply arrangements have environmental criteria. But of course, how do you continuously raise the bar on those and research each of those and raise the bar and et cetera. Next slide. So the way forward for us is really, we're calling it high impact categories of spend. We really want to focus on GHG emissions, waste, and climate resilience. We want to focus on the high impact categories of spend, which is buildings, fleet, electricity, construction materials, big services. Should we want to incent suppliers to have a Paris-based agreement, target and disclose their carbon, for example. We want to look at where's the plastic waste. So, in terms of, we want to eliminate single-use plastics. So you're the federal government, that means defense, corrections, science labs, and office buildings. We often think office buildings, but actually think of those other things first. And of course, circular economy principles are key to getting us to net zero carbon and minimizing waste. So, and then of course you need all the support training tools and all that stuff. So I'll go to the, I think that's it, eh? Is there another slide or is that? I think we end there. So I'm happy to take questions et continuer la discussion.
Merci. Thank you, Nick. They're starting to roll in and get the juices flowing. Maybe I'll ask a couple of my own. You know that's coming. In terms of, obviously the breadth and scope of your organization, 75 different departments, 200,000 employees, you've got your marching orders, but a lot of this is about, human change management. And what we're seeing and what around procurement is sort of this is the way we always do it. There are legal reasons, there are sole sourcing issues, there might even be international agreement issues that might prevent some of the things that you want to integrate into the requirements. Can you talk a little bit about your process to sort of thread this through everything that government does and buys, and how you navigate your process?
Yeah, sure. I'd happy to. But part of my answer in procurement is always it depends on the category of buy. And so, so in a lot of categories, we're lucky on the environmental side that I would argue that they're technical criteria. Like if you want to buy an electric car, it's a technical criteria. And so, so often you can get away with it because it really is technical criteria in the building. Like if you want a zero carbon emissions building, you put that in the technical criteria. And so it isn't a trade issue per se. Now in other areas, like we're looking at, what can we require on suppliers, then you get into more trade agreement kind of things. And so some things you can incent versus require. Maybe you leave it open, but you say that any supplier we deal with on big contracts have to disclose their carbon and have a science-based target. But anybody can win it, but then there's bonus points or whatever, right? If you do that, and so this is an area we're testing. We've piloted already with a couple of big financial contracts, services contracts. But how do you make sure your suppliers are on board? Well, if they have the same overall target as you do, then you're going to get to zero. But then then you got to look at the trade, and that's a different situation than a technical requirement than something else. One of the things we're really excited with by signing the free trade agreement with Europe is Europe's so far ahead on a lot of areas that if they're requiring stuff, then well, we have a trade agreement with Europe. So why aren't we requiring the same stuff? And it'll pass the trade agreement side. So I would say if we just look at technical requirements, if we look at creative ways to use the flexibilities in existing trade agreements, because there are flexibilities there. If we look at doing as well as our trade partners who we've signed agreements with, like there's a lot of room to grow there before we hit certain barriers of no, you can't do that because it's in a trade agreement. And so I'm relatively optimistic there that we haven't collected all the low-hanging fruit, I would say.
And your processes develop requirements then? I mean, obviously, you're not doing that on your own in a silo. You're doing that with department heads, I would assume. So you come up with criteria that pass the test of maybe trade, but can the marketplace deliver? So can you talk about that process?
Yeah, so I think what we've started with is very clearly we need to know what environmental criteria we care about. So I keep using greenhouse gas emissions. So then we took that one and we said, okay, where are the big categories? And then we get together the key experts. So I call it the procurement ecosystem. Like you kind of need the champion. We'll call ourselves the champion, right? So we're the ones pushing. We need outcomes. We need outcomes. Then I bring to the table the experts on buildings. And then I bring, so that could be the National Research Council's Construction Institute, the Natural Resources Canada Energy Efficiency Office, the key kind of department, Public Works or PSPC department who owns a lot of real property. I bring the experts together with the procurement, the buyer, like the procurement officer or specialist, plus the client. So there's kind of a 4-person exchange that needs to happen, I would argue. The champion, the expert, the buyer, and the client. And so if you get those four together, and you have to kind of educate them at the same time, then we can focus on particular big contracts and big buys. But in each of those categories, we also do the same just to set the requirements. So we have a policy on green procurement. Under that, we're going to set mandatory requirements. We've set those mandatory requirements in the greening. We've used the greening government strategy to set mandatory requirements, which has been approved by the government, by cabinet. And so what's beautiful now is we have I'm calling them mandatory requirements, because they're focused on outcomes. Like, they're not so much about the procurement process, but it's every building has to be zero carbon. Every car that we're going to buy has to be, right? So we set those mandatory requirements, but we always get the 5 biggest owners of stuff with the experts on that topic. So we got Transport Canada, for example. When we wanted to set a fleet target, we got Transport Canada, who's working on setting a fleet target for the country, sitting with the 5 biggest fleet owning departments. And we sat them together, and we're the champions, so we keep pushing them. And we say we need a good target. And so we negotiated it that way in terms of our targets. So you can bring in external experts. We're the feds, so we're a little larger. We have some internal expertise, but we also bring in external experts. And in all cases, usually the client who wants to buy, the questions they have is it hard technically? Like, educate me, and is it going to cost me money?
Right. Of course. And so is it your client, which I guess is your department colleagues? When you say client, that's the context under which, okay. Is it their responsibility then to manage the implementation of those new requirements, the procurement exercise, the RFPs, et cetera? Is it, you're educating them and then they're off?
Yeah, the client. So the client department, corrections or defense or whoever, is accountable for that building that they're going to buy, or the good or service they buy, right? And so they need to, we need to show them that it's technically easy, and give them all the tools and everything, and that it cost over the life cycle is actually really good for them. And then we set the requirement as Treasury Board. So we have the advantage that we can set a requirement as Treasury Board, and then they have to implement for sure. They own, manage, and implement the whole thing. And then we will ask for reporting.
Okay, so they report to you. Okay, so maybe the questions are still coming in. One more before I go to them. Can you talk generally then about the reaction from vendors and suppliers of starting to see language like, these outcomes-based, low resilient, low carbon, circularity, low waste? Has there been, how has the reaction been by vendors and suppliers, especially in these big buy categories?
Yeah, in the big buy categories, we tend to deal with bigger companies, and so the reaction is actually surprisingly not exciting. They're like, tell us what you want, we'll build it for you. You want a zero carbon building? Sure, just ask for it. We can build you whatever you want. So because like you look at the kind of contract split, like we're not really focused on mom and pop providing muffins at the local meeting kind of thing, like the small catering kind of stuff. We're focused on the big stuff: construction, buildings, fleet, big equipment, IT. And again, like on IT, you're having a conversation with the Googles and the Microsofts on cloud services. They're like, well, how come you haven't asked for it 3 years ago? So only net zero by 2050. We're going to be zero by 2030. So now it depends the business you're in. I'm using some low-hanging fruit. You can imagine some sectors that are harder. But even like cement, we're talking to the cement industry, and they're like, you can ask for Portland limestone cement tomorrow, and it's 10% better, and you could do some other things that might get it to even better than that. So then it's getting the big machine on our side, getting our clients who own the bridge to be sure that they feel safe with this new kind of cement, even though the industry is saying, yeah, just ask for it. It's ready to go. So that's kind of so the industry reaction. And I'm kind of a business grad, so I grew up in the tradition of the customer asks for what the customer wants, and the business will provide it. So
yeah, that's been very consistent with all levels of governments. Right now our focus on municipalities, it's the vending community has almost been in front of them, ahead of them, just saying, give me a specs, I'll meet them. It's not a problem. Okay, so I'll go to the questions now. We've got 5 to 6 minutes left. from Megan Meany, who I think you know, Megan from ICLE. She's giving you a good to see you again, Nick. So obviously she knows you. Do you anticipate getting into offsets in order to bring emissions to net zero?
So good question. So we're on our scope 1 and 2 emissions. We are not gonna. We're not starting with offsets. We actually on buildings and regular. I'll call it conventional fleet. We have a target of 90% of it is going to be reached through reductions, internal actions to reduce those emissions. It's a net zero target, so there could be a sort of a 10% carbon removal type of concept in the future. On aircraft and marine, so think Navy, Air Force, that kind of thing, we are allowing a bigger carbon removal component because that's going to be the main solution will be low carbon fuels or carbon removal. So a very high end offset, if you will. But we are aiming for things like grants and contributions and things that are indirect or we fund other projects or other things. If a proponent wants to buy offsets, like say we pay for somebody to put on a conference and they want to buy offsets, then of course then that would be great, and we're keen on that. So I think we like the idea of offsets in certain situations, in certain cases, but for the buildings and the fleet we own, I think our focus is really reducing those emissions ourselves.
Okay, great, that's excellent. Maybe I'll flip over to plastics for a little bit, because I know that's coming fast and furious, and you've been really focused on low carbon, and you know, obviously your focus is going to expand. Do you anticipate doing a similar heat map, I guess, with your spend for plastics as you did with low carbon?
Yes, so we have done a sort of a preliminary, a very high level heat map, and we are now running some pilots actually on like retrofitting. So you know what we found is there's a lot of plastics and waste in construction, in packaging, in things like that, and so we're doing some pilots on the kind of construction side and refit kind of retrofit side. On packaging, we did an RFI on how we can bring that down. So it's kind of trying to explore what can we do in those areas. I think we need to do more in terms of the heat map, go a bit more in detail on the heat map on the plastic usage, and see what we can do. And then single-use plastics, obviously COVID's kind of PPEs and things like that are a big area of interest now. So how can we we're working with our health department on providing guidance, or how can we develop some guidance in terms of not running out and buying all single-use stuff when you could buy reusable stuff. And so that's a big area of interest for us now as well. But I think we've done a level of heat map. We need to do a second level, but already we're trying to move on certain things like interior fittings and things, packaging and PPEs, for example.
Okay. And is the exercises that you go through, these heat mapping, the sort of inventory of your spends, do you make that information public? Is that something that we could actually, or is that
So
still proprietary?
No, what I want to do, because our procurement spend data is all on open data, and if somebody has a smart sort of student who can sift through all the data, you can pull stuff together. But what we're trying to do is save people some time. So our heat map of our carbon emissions, for example, is something I'd like to get up on the web over the next month or so that people can just see the example. We used the Seed Egg Institute in University of Montreal to do the study for us. And it was a very neat study to do. Here's the procurement spend. Here's the carbon emission factors for each of that spend area. And so this is and this is where plastic, circular economy, and carbon come together really nicely. What we found is things like cement, steel, fuels, and plastics are some of the highest.
Oh no, I hope I lost you there for a second, Nick. Okay, I think we may have some technical, or he may have some technical issues on his side. I'm hoping that everyone can still hear me. So unfortunately, I think what we'll do, I'm not sure if he can get back on quickly. We've got a ton of questions. So, you know, we only have 2 minutes left. So we did get through the most of it. We'll check on Nick to make sure that, oh, maybe I think he's coming back on. So it is 1 o'clock. We've got, I think, the better part of 20 questions to get through. Oh, there you are, Nick.
Back, sorry about that.
There you go. That's no problem. That's not a problem. So we got you in mid-sentence there, but maybe what we can.
We'll try and make it as public as we can. Like, we're going to try and put all our materials public so we can learn from each other.
Good. Excellent. One last question, even though we've got lots in the hopper, and I just wanted to let all the registrants know, obviously, we'll take all your questions, we'll answer them, and we'll send the answers to all of the registrants so that they can benefit from the information. But a government colleague from BC, Mr. Bob Paul, with respect to federal transfer of funds to provinces and territories, are there now conditions on circular reporting on expenditures in line with federal circular procurement framework? That's a loaded one.
Yeah, so we obviously, our group worries about procurement and the stuff we own. So transfers is a different category, but we're working collectively with our Infrastructure Canada folks, for example, who have a lot of transfers, because whatever we learn on sort of what we put on conditions on our building, we want to work with partners like BC, cities of Vancouver, some of the leading cities, find out what they're doing. But it's like you said earlier, Joanne, like, you can move faster on procurement, right? Like, we control that. It's in our decision-making wheelhouse. We can put any conditions we want on ourselves as an organization. And so that's the part where we could de-risk stuff, like maybe stuff we'd like to do with the provinces, maybe there's a risk or an uncertainty, but maybe we just do it ourselves, or BC does it and we learn from each other, and then we could de-risk other kind of areas. But I won't speak too much. We'd have to consult with the folks doing the transfers, whatever program and mandate. And we transfer money to provinces on everything from immigration services to infrastructure to whatever. So I don't want to speak to what you'd have to look at each of those things.
Yep. Big opportunity. And I think part of our goal with circularprocurement.ca is to transfer that knowledge openly, exactly the way, a mechanism for folks to come in and see what others are doing and to transfer some of that information at a touch of a button. So stay tuned for that. We are at 1:01. We've gone over by 1 minute. My apologies for that. We've still got everybody still with us. So I just want to again thank you, Nick, so much for taking the time to be with us today. You came with you have so much more to talk about. I know that, and I'm hoping that this is the first of many times that we can feature you in the work that you're doing. I know it's ever changing and ongoing and getting bigger as we speak. So on behalf of my organization, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us. For everybody on the webinar, this is recording, and we will send out the live recording to you if you want to have it there, and are obviously for future use. And we've got our PowerPoint presentation for you to dig into as well. We are available if anybody wants to follow up with us on any of this material. Stay tuned for circularprocurement.ca. Thank you so much. Stay safe, and we'll be in touch.